Thanks everyone for coming. First of all, thanks also for Manu's and Claudia's invitation to be here today. I thought it was very stimulating, the title, the title of the conference, Alien Memory, for many reasons. One of the reasons is that I often don't talk about the word memory, but it's a word that I constantly thinking about it by different methods or words or places. I normally use the word either generation, transmission, and I think I try to do this in 3 to 4 ways. I'm an architect from Brazil, originally from Brazil. I live in London for the last, believe me or not, 15, 16 years. That's the damage after 16 years in London. Just put the time so I check myself. And so the conversation today I thought was very exciting to try to frame a few things between the practice, the academia, and how this has enabled us to move forward. And I in the Ostos and teaching at the AA and the Bartlett, to frame the questions of how memory or how generational legacy is transmitted, and through that transmission, how parts or blocks of it are lost, and how we tend to look backwards to those blocks with sometimes nostalgia. Other people look forward with those blocks as something quite positive. So I titled this hopefully 20-minute conversation, Scavenging at the End of the World. And it was quite stimulating to hear the Alexandra and Claudia's conversations, because I think probably are going to be touching a few things in a different way, and I think I really look forward for the chat at the end of the session. So normally this is what we expect when you think about the end of the world. We expect the cataclysm, the eschatological end of the planet, the reassessing of species and the hierarchy of places, like the 70s Planet of the Apes. So this eschatological moment, so present, for example, in the great Western tradition of Christianity, Hebrew, and also Marxism, the constant idea of the repositioning of a new beginning, is something that, being raised in Brazil, is something that ended up being quite embedded in my DNA. And I always somehow try to shake the box with the places I visit and the things I do, to think about what are the blocks of knowledge, the blocks of information that are being lost. And if the end of the world is this total loss, how can we then assess moments where the total loss occurs? How can we go to a place, a situation, an environment where that radical notion of nostalgia almost is not possible, where you articulated the vision to the past simply maybe as a biological survival? So this is another end of the world in the coast of Chittagong that we visited 16 months ago, I believe, or 15. Bangladesh is one of the number one country suffering from the effects of global warming. And around the area of Chittagong, what happens here, you see, don't have a laser point, but I think he's that guy here. I don't know if he's a ship or is the fence, but this coast, the water shifts 3 kilometers per year. So a year ago, or now when we were there, the coast was 3 kilometers that way. So the sea level rise is constantly coming towards the coast, and it's incredible to simply see, not in the text, but to experience that idea where you see the coast fragmenting, you see you experience the plates of grass and the plates of soil already salinized, and you see the surface of the earth simply extruding, opening canals, so canals of the sea enter inside the coast, inside the land, salinization of the soil, and the migration of one of the number one people somehow by default that we start working with or analyzing, which are fishermen. They constantly migrate. So through this research, one started looking at the possibility of what then is this confrontation of the end of the world, and what are the aspects that can occur? Can it be saved through technology? Can it be harassed through repossessing the habitat that it has gone? So suddenly, immediately, we can, to an easy argument, we can start thinking about this duality between returning to a past that is perhaps not possible, and going towards a future that might be optimistic, that might be techno-fueled, or that might be quite traditional. So to make that point clear, this is a book by Arthur C. Clarke, Fountains of Paradise. He wrote this while he was living in Sri Lanka. It's a book that really establishes the construction of a space elevator. And this space elevator is by a very ambitious engineer. He's not an architect, but we all megalomaniac anyway. So his positioning this is the best place where to build the space elevator is on a sacred mountain where the Buddhist monks live. So he has this challenge of convincing the monks to move out, because he needs to build that for the sake of humanity, which is not just going out of the planet because the planet is dying, but the narrative here is economical and very egocentrical as well. So I think the book established a very interesting relationship of how the monks fight that fight and what are the arguments of permanence of this mountain in Sri Lanka and this monastery. This is Sigiri, which is a nearby mountain. Then you establish two ways of thinking what I want to talk today, which one is the idea, the association of technology and progress with the uprooting of communities, not directly but indirect by infrastructural projects, this time not dams or roads, but by this futuristic, what's the name? Just forgot. Space elevator. And by the other side, you also establishing the connectivity between the people, the tradition that is being literally uprooted, not just from the ground, but to space, from these traditions and the permanence of this, as some authors call archaic ontology. You know, these ontologies which are connected to a deep past, which are connected to a very cyclical laws of based on myths and based on a enclosed understanding where progress is not necessarily important, the progress outside of that system of belief. So inside this archaic ontology, you start having the establishment then of the two cliches, no? One is the technology as the displacer, and another one is the locals as the sufferer of that displacement, and the loss then where the monks go. They go to pray in a temple now in the capital of Colombo in the book. So then you start looking at this possibility of why and how this idea of the end of the world only as this eschatological performance, but how the end of the world as a cosmology, the end of the world as a body of belief is constantly happening. So once we visit the fishermen in Bangladesh, their cosmology is gone. No, the belief of the habitat of waking up at a certain time, the belief from religion to patterns of daily experience, that is being blown not just by they becoming scavengers, but they migrate into the countryside of cities, but they have new names. No, they call homeless now, and they beg, and their sons or their daughters and the generational is simply see them as beggars. And this is a pattern happen especially around nearby the equator line, from dams, as we talked many times about it in the past, the displacement of communities by large infrastructural projects. So that book captures that very, very interesting, and that is slow loss of memory of that legacy leads to, in Bangladesh, to radicalization, the rise of ISIS, and also to a consequence in the West as well, in many other ways that this is not the talk of today. But so we're very interested to go into places like that, and also in the forest where you have, this is a community in Borneo that we had the pleasure to visit, which are the forest people, and try to see how that fragmentation of the archaic ontology, of the mythology that we read on books, that we acknowledge as part of the sacred, is being aestheticized by us as well, is being commodified, and also how we can take them out of the cliche that the future is and progress is external to the archaic ontology, to the legacy that they have. One of the interesting moments in this visit, after we probably drunk rice alcohol for 4 or 5 hours and almost had to cut a head of a chicken inside that hut on the back, and they were constantly talking to us about how they wanted education, how they wanted not just to be part to be owned by the company who owns that space, but how they said for us to go back and to give them education, whatever that means. I'm not an anthropologist, but I think it's very interesting that Dayak, the forest people, moved to a camp now. They used to live literally in the forest. They are in a camp. The fishermen in Bangladesh, they moved to the roadside. I don't know where they are now. Maybe they are part of the 3,000, 2,500 people that migrate to the capital of Bangladesh per day due to global warming dislocating people. So immediately you think at the dislocation of culture and the immediate relevance to a past that was better than the present. And you start looking at the concept of land, the idea of promised land, the idea of a future promised land, that something will be better, no? Which is part of the great arcs of knowledge of this Western sacred religions that dislocate the archaic ontology to the future, no? The promised land. And you start having that access that the promised land now is not in the future anymore. For a lot of the fishermen and people that we talked to the last 10 years, the promised land is the past. The promised land is a return for something that was a lot better than to live in a roadside. So something else that we consider inside the dislocation of our perception of the other, is how through the digital understanding of our lives, how the bubbles from Facebook also create this constant patching and surrounding and fencing of knowledge into bubbles of perception, and as we all know, the Facebook bubble, that suddenly create the patterns of which facilitates our perception of these other communities and us as active as architects, either as the saviors or as the guy who's going to go on the ground and dealing with the survival architecture at the end of the world, which is building bamboo houses and helping firsthand on that development. So I'm very interested in not doing that because I don't know how to do that. And I'm interested in one of the questions, when facing our current social environmental problems, how can myths and cross-generational stories serve as departure points without restricting outcomes to symmetrical or atavistic resolutions? Sounds very heavy. I took this literally as a copy and paste out of the book that is coming out in September, our book. But basically this is a question that talks, when we as architects are looking at the idea of context, are looking at how the generational legacy or perhaps the memory of space is transmitted, how can we look at that without necessarily doing the pattern copy, what is set as the belief of a culture that is transmitted through us, already stabilized in books and stabilized in our libraries, on our zeitgeist, on our bubbles. Remember many years ago, before 2008, where everyone was building Dubai was using Islamic patterns and kind of just beating the hell out of those patterns in Rhino, and almost every building had that pattern, whatever that was already the zeitgeist of utilizing that in Islamic buildings. So we're very interested by that dislocation, and it already put us in a place where how can we not face that question of perhaps the theme of today as with this symmetrical question? How can we perhaps bringing hijacking your first talk, Alexander, already thinking how perhaps these notions of estrangement are intrinsically positive and necessary to our understanding. Uh, Hijacking even more by a student here in the audience. We do that by visiting places like Peru and in the studying the how we can transmit the tensions. For example, in Cusco, where we have a high level of tourists, where you have a high level of the creating the pattern of tradition becoming a fetish. So these are some vessels, and these vessels are very crucial to a part of the presentation I'm doing, because they are people, these are their houses. These are a maquette of their houses that they used to take away with them, sometimes with water, sometimes to blow wind, to make sounds. And you can see the scale differentiation, that the person is almost the size of a house in the middle one. So you have that clash of realities, the clash of the perception of how you take the context, you take your life inside the house, and this was a great part of what they did. And also how you read that then one step further in the landscape, where they didn't have the same word that we had for city. The forest, the edge of those temples were not a no man's land. They were still part of that, I don't know if I should call urbanization or pre-industrial civilization. They were part of that pattern of living. So you can see that from the culture of the manufacture of the artifact to the vast landscapes that, although the Incas didn't have a written language, they wrote that through the landscape, diverting rivers, terraforming the coast, terraforming the topography of the mountains. So suddenly you start seeing that the scripting of a culture also pre-Anthropocene and highly also active and perhaps aggressive in that form. So to start going more into the work, the story of transformation of mythology. So the story of transformation of this legacy of this, what used to make these communities tied, and a self-belief on that structure that they used to share. The story of transformation of mythology from its original primitive form, in which the vision is backward, to a form characteristic of crisis and change of end of civilization, in which the vision is forward, is an important part of the story of utopias and planning for reform. So it's quite interesting that this anthropologist was one of the first ones who challenged us to look at culture as dynamic, that it doesn't make sense for anthropologists to look at cultures as tied as a vessel, but to look at that as a dynamic aspect, was that he came with a different route for what we came with, similar to our findings, that at the moment that the mythology, the myth that tied the community together is lost, you can either go look at the promised land as this backward looking, or you shift the mythology towards this prospective rather than retrospective moment. And perhaps that's part of the birth or afterbirth for the idea of utopias, no? The idea that there's something there coming from the sacred narrative, the dislocation of people from their lands. So these words, culture, the idea of dislocation, the idea of how culture is dynamic, the idea of how the digital interface and the digital filter and the mechanisms that are recreating our mechanical use of, like Charlie Chaplin in his film was turning the gear, and then the gear start turning himself as a allusion to man being mechanized by the machine in the industrial society, and how these elements of today are a lot more libidinal. No, it's we with the phone on Facebook, like on Instagram, or seeing constantly being part of that new libidinal infrastructure that is part also of the digital platforms. So how that is dislocating what we advocating as positive, as a dynamic culture, and how the idea of context, the contexts which are familiar, are this that create new types of prosaic local, which we call phantoms, where this generational legacy is then already corrupted, is already part of an ongoing dynamic culture as it occurs, but also is radicalized by this fence which tighten up the appreciation for the banal. Not the culture banal, but the high points of exchange of cultures, from patterns to... and we look also at chromatic, like if anyone plays music, and we know that the most boring music is the one that doesn't have any surprise. And chromaticism in music is when you land a note that sounds out of the scale. Like if you like jazz, or Miles Davis, or dissonant, jazz is dissonant, you constantly, where is this song going? There is the constant on looking for that pattern, and maybe they don't even end. So some pop music, for example, they constantly don't have dissonant notes. They hardly have chromatism. It's constantly going on this within the scale. So we're looking in our practice as chromatism and perspective. So we look at rewiring of technology by one of our students, of how when we visited Kampung in Indonesia, and the problem of water, the notion of the alien, the notion of the that is addressing a practical problem but has a very different aesthetic based either on cultural legacy reading or simply on the idea of performance. You start bringing that substratum of technology, not just the elevator, the space elevator. Also the idea of how 3D printing through melting plastic can be part of these ideas that although it's a house, although it's a typical typology, is delivered through different materials and colors. Perhaps the colors similar not to the legacy of people through generations, but is the pattern of the consumption of plastics they have from drinking Coke and Pepsi Cola. And when this is cut, this is also the post-contextual. Also another technique to deal with that, how speculating dimensioning, how the zoom out between planets, between the human body, between the organisms, between the dislocation. So we're looking very, very hard not to work with maps. We're looking hard also to bring together of the dimensioning of our occupation on the planet, the dimensioning of the constantly wiring of the consequence of what we do today, are positioning these different compositions. And so perhaps you might be surprised by that word appearing here. But we like to speculate dimensions when the city scale perhaps is confronted with building scale, is confronted with the interior scale. So we create these maps, these three-dimensional models where plans and sections and plans interact to create those crashes when in one representation mode you have the discussion of the several geographies clashing in, and to perhaps enable artistic reading of the context, but hopefully to bring a different understanding of what is embedded in a project and its consequence. Also looking at Varanasi not just as the ancient city in the world, but producing drawings and compositions where we explore the digitalization of the domestic in Varanasi, which is being hailed as is one of the oldest cities in the world, and is also one of the first cities to become a smart city. That's what the mayors are playing. So we're looking constantly at this confrontation, and while a city and interior of a house start perhaps describing more about this Varanasi Indian city condition than less one or the other. And the third perhaps strategy, going towards the end now, is looking at the experiencing collision. And this collision, we try to again look at this dimensioning of the scale, looking from this project is in the Amazon, is related to understanding the Amazon forest and the edge of the deforesting area or due to logging. How rather than to discuss that only on that scale, which sounds that we invite at least me to talk about a speculative project to create a certain scale of political understanding of that project or provocation, how we can bring that to this collision of scales when we can experience. So I'm talking about installations, looking at the Amazon forest not just as green, but looking at the Amazon forest as this confrontation of drones which are surveilling drugs coming from different countries in Brazil, Also confronting the idea that Amazon is a virgin forest, which is not, is an androcene landscape by years and years of nomads traveling the landscape. So rather than to constantly talk about the Amazon as this continental body, multinational body, we try to compact this scale dimensioning, and you can experience from several scales of the materiality of the proposed project to at the same time experiencing the machines and how this rewiring of drones, perhaps not for surveillance, by data gathering, and then going into models which are a lot smaller and dealing with then this more continental landscape. So these installations like this one building, École Spéciale in Paris, they constantly dealing with neither the return to a past, not a technophile future of the elevator, but constantly this confrontation of how can a sensorial architecture that is gathering that data can output that in an experiential node. So from this one, we were very interested that this installation will change after 4 weeks of staying there. It will change its color, will become dirtier, will become wetter due to the use. While people visit, these creatures were constantly moving and connecting and giving outputs on the structure. Or looking at our domestic impact on our private lives, packed up with iPads and iPhones. We look at how, in this installation, how our private life, instead of being computed in this, the computational power is part of a keyboard and a screen. We look at how this could be part of our augmented reality domestic layer. So this physical installation was called ectoplasmatic housing. So it's not a house, no one enters inside the structure, but by each layer you had this augmented reality blossoming and reappearing and changing according to the movement of people in the landscape, the data feeding of people, and it was an allusion to how we could experience our private domestic life, not in the device, but within a spatial understanding where we know somehow what means danger and what means possibilities of pleasure. So perhaps going towards a conclusion, so I'm very, very interested on the alienation of generational transmission. I'm interested on how that perhaps is an intrinsic part of our reality through the digital layer, through the constant displacement of communities, and our understanding of that, sometimes as alienators, sometimes as being alienated, but the idea perhaps of the alien body, the idea of this constant uncanny, the idea of this confrontation of either scales, of the rewiring of what we expect to be somewhere else, we bring it in a different place, can bring to experience not a dichotomy between nature and city, between the future and the present, or between memory and future, but really embed these patterns into a confrontation and some sort of discourse like we try to do in projects, or some of the guests also do. Thank you very much.